Okay, let's do another nice game of chess. All right, welcome back. Hope you're having a nice weekend. It's been a good one. So we're doing Capablanca today. So if you haven't heard of Capablanca, he's a Cuban absolute world class chess player. Um, this game was played in 1909, and there's a bit of funny history behind this game. So essentially. It was basically played to decide who would be like the US champion. So the reason behind that was that the previous champion had died a few years earlier, and it was played between Frank James Marshall, who was essentially the sort of assumed US champion, and Capablanca, who was like sort of the challenger. Um, you might be thinking, well, I just told you that Capablanca was Cuban. Why is he playing to be US champion if he's Cuban? Well, in 1909, Cuba was it was what was let me just look up the it was a possession of the United States. So essentially they weren't quite US citizens, but they weren't quite not US citizens. So interestingly, after Capablanca won the overall match, not necessarily saying he won this game, but after he won the overall match, um, uh, Frank James Marshall, his opponent, said, "Oh no, he can't be U.S. champion. He's not a U.S. citizen." So pretty sneaky from Frank James Marshall there. But yeah, so there you have it. So anyway, let's dive into the game. So oh yeah, and one other thing, after this sort of disagreement, they essentially consulted a lawyer, like the chess body consulted a lawyer, saying, "Well, who is the champion then after Capablanca won, but he's from Cuba." And the lawyer gave this quote above, below my head. It said, "Well, neither of you is the champion. We're going to give it to W. Showalter, who is basically the previous world champion, and he was retired at that point. He was really old, and yeah, it was a bit funny. But so let's jump into the game after that nice little story. So Capablanca is playing the black pieces, and Frank James Marshall playing the white pieces, and it's a really fun attacking game. This one, so yeah, it's a bit of a ride. So d4, d5, c4, e6. So this is and knight c3. This is called the Queen's Gambit declined because this pawn has been declined. Um, Obviously, like it's up for grabs at the moment. It's not defended by anything, but you don't usually want to capture it because white can then play e4 and then the bishop attacks the pawn, and you're probably going to win the pawn back, and all you did was just give white control of the center. So loads of top level games. In fact, loads of the games in the Magnus Carlsen Invitational were the Queen's Gambit declined. If you watched that was played a few weeks ago. So knight f6. A lot of book moves to start this game, so I'll go quite quickly through the first few. Bishop d5, just pinning the knight, and bishop e7, always a good idea to unpin immediately. E3, just adding more strength to the centre, and knight e4. So this comes within a triple attack on the bishop, so you don't really want to move it back. So you capture your opponent's bishop, and they are going to recapture. And now bishop to d3. Capablanca sort of added a comment here saying that if you play down this line as white and you're in this position, he prefers immediately capturing the pawn here because he said it gives black too much of a nice game if you don't. But anyway, Frank James Marshall disagrees. He goes for bishop to d3. It does ask black the question, what are you going to do with this knight, because it's attacked twice and defended once. So he says, well, I'm going to take your knight and double up your pawns. Capablanca captures the c pawn, and Frank James Marshall recaptures the bishop. You might be wondering, why did Capablanca make that capture? It's always a good principle in chess, like never to capture unless it provides you an advantage. So like this idea of like maintaining the tension in the position, because it makes things more complicated. The reason he did is that this pawn was previously on the square; it's now off the board, and this diagonal's been opened up for the white square, the dark square bishop, or the black white square bishop. So crucially, the white light square bishop can't come here because the pawn defends that square. But after b6, the black bishop's going to get this lovely diagonal. So, yeah, b6 was played. Queen f3, just sort of putting a quash on the plans for a moment, because this comes with an attack on the rook, and you can't develop your bishop immediately, otherwise it will just get taken. So c6 defends that threat, and knight e2, just developing your last minor piece. Bishop b7, which is what was planned, and now obviously you're threatening to push this pawn with an attack on the queen. It's not necessarily a huge threat, but you know, discovered attacks are always a bit nasty to deal with. But Frank James Marshall says, well, it's not a big enough threat. I'm just going to castle. I don't want to, you know, we've seen enough games already where they ended badly because people didn't castle. So, nice castle by both sides. And a4. Capablanca added another little comment here saying that, this is from his book, by the way, saying essentially it wasn't a great move, a4, a bit of a waste of time. Seemingly, the idea is to control this square, but white isn't really bothered if black pushes this, or he shouldn't be bothered if black pushes this. Just move the bishop back, and in fact he will move the bishop back later on in the game, as you'll see. So, bit of a waste of time. So anyway, c5. So there we go. That discovered attack has come, but it's not a big problem. You don't really mind if black captures this pawn after you move your queen, because you can just strengthen the center. So queen g3, just getting out of the attack of the bishop, and knight c6, developing the last minor piece. Knight comes to f4, and Capablanca said in his book, this is the point where white's turned his focus onto the black king. He's going to try and make an attack happen. There's a principle in chess about, like, essentially, it's not always true, but the idea is that if you have more attacking pieces around your opponent's king than they have defending pieces, and pawns don't really count for the purpose of defending pieces, then generally your attack will be successful. So, Frank needs to try and get some more pieces involved here, because at the very least the queen and the rook defend the king. He's only really got the knight and the queen eyeing it up at the moment. So, how is this going to continue? Rook a to c8, just improving your rooks. Bishop a2, you don't want to leave your bishop on this line where the rook can eye it, because if the knight moves and then the pawn captures, well, if the knight moves, you're immediately threatening to capture with the pawn, because with the bishop still there, it will come with an attack on the bishop, and you'll have to move the bishop and then give up another pawn. So, bishop a2, just getting out of those nasty ideas, and rook f to d8, just improving the final piece. So Capablanca is fully mobilized now. So rook f, f to e1. We always talk about putting your rooks on the same line as queens. You never know when this line will open up. So, this line, yeah, it's always good. Just put it on the same line as the queen. Make your opponent sweat. And knight to a5. And after this move, rook f to e1, Capablanca says that he's now ready to win the a4 pawn. So let's see how he's going to do that. So the idea is knight to a5, and this comes with a few ideas. Idea number one, you can put your bishop where the knight was with an attack on the pawn, which is currently not defended by any pieces. Idea number two, you can play c4, now it's defended by the knight, and that's going to trap this light square bishop in. You don't really like the light square bishop that's eyeing your king, even though it's x-raying through a couple of pawns. Still not very nice. So, yeah, this is an idea. So rook a to d1. Frank James Marshall decides he doesn't want to play really passively and just defend the pawn with his pieces. He's going to go for an attack. So he's sort of abandoning the pawn with that move. And bishop c6. There are a few options in this position. The move played was queen g4, and it's quite a potent move, and we'll come back to why later, or in a moment. But there is another option in this position which is noteworthy. D5. So the idea behind D5, it's just a bit. It just sort of breaks open the position, and you don't really have. It's quite forcing. So black has to recapture with the pawn. You get your knight onto a lovely square. The knight can't be recaptured as it's defended by two pieces and only attacked by two. You need more attackers than defenders to capture in general. So the queen comes back to f8 as it was attacked by the knight. And now you can start to mobilise your pieces. You can move your queen here, bishop here with an attack on this pawn. So it's a nice it's a nice position. But anyway, FJM goes for queen to g4. And the reason this is a bit of a sneaky move is that if Capablanca just goes, oh, well, that does nothing, that's a rubbish move, I'm just going to take your pawn as planned, well, Mr. Capablanca, it actually does do something, because you've got this nice knight takes on e6, and you might think, well, doesn't this just blunder a knight for a pawn? Well, no, it doesn't, because you don't really have any option to ignore the knight and just give up a pawn, because you're threatening checkmate here and to capture the rook, so it's essentially a sort of a bit of a fork. So you have to take the knight back. You can't take with the queen because the bishop attacked the square, so you have to take with the pawn. And now the bishop comes here with check, forking the king and the rook. Again, if you don't want to lose your queen, you just have to move the king out of the way, and the bishop takes the rook, and you don't even have the option to recapture with the rook because the queen defends the bishop. So yeah, you can take the rook down here, but you just get captured back. And now, okay, White's a pawn up, but he's got a much nicer position. And you know, if you can go into an endgame like this against Capablanca, a pawn up, then you're happy days. You know, you're doing great. So queen g4, and instead of taking the pawn immediately, because we just explained why that was a rubbish move, we get not d4 but queen g4, c4. So c4, it just blocks the bishop in. You know, nothing to do here with this bishop. He's going to have to maneuver it to this diagonal now in the future. So all those ideas are out the window now, because now if you capture the knight, the pawn recaptures you, and then you've got nothing because the bishop is blocked. Okay, so good move by Capablanca, and d5 now. So it's a little bit different, this d5 move by Marshall. Probably a better move would have been to play bishop b1 and go for an attack on this pawn, put the queen here maybe, threaten checkmate, but he goes for d5. It is a forcing move, so you know, black's got to react to it, but let's see how Capablanca reacts. So he says, okay, well, I'm going to take this pawn with my bishop, because it came with an attack on the bishop. I can take this pawn for free, as planned, because it comes with an attack on the rook. So you can't really do much with this d4 move immediately, because you have to react to the fact your rook's under threat. So rook comes to d2, and then Capablanca played e5. It was a bit of a weird move. He said he wasn't really happy with it after he played it. The reason why it's a bit weird is because White's still not threatening to capture this pawn, because if you do, the black rook takes your rook for free. So you don't have to do anything with this pawn immediately. And it probably would have been better to play g6 and then play f5 and e5, and then you just have a much nicer pawn structure. But anyway, excuse me. Instead, he plays e5. So it does come with an attack on the knight, so the knight has to react. So the knight goes to here, threatening checkmate. Queen attacks this square with the knight. So g6 to prevent that. Crucially, the pawn is pinned. It can't take the knight because the queen eyes the king. So that's something important to bear in mind. So you don't necessarily have to move this knight. If you do move this knight, then black just gets too nice a position. The bishop comes here with an attack on the queen. The queen's got to move, and then after f5, black's completely consolidated. You don't have an attack anymore, and this pawn in the middle is looking a bit weak. So definitely you don't want to do that. So g6, d6 instead. So this comes with an attack on the queen, and again, you've got to be careful here, because if you immediately jump into something like, obviously you don't want to take with the queen because the rook will take your queen, but if you jump into something like rook captures, then the queen just comes here to take your rook, and you've lost a rook. So this rook is now undefended. So instead, after d6, Capablanca just slowly plays queen to e6, offers a queen trade. He says, well, I'm a pawn up. I will happily trade queens with you, FJM. So queen g5, so maintaining this pin, because you don't want to drop the knight for no reason. And also, it defends this square now, so that the knight can come here with check. So we'll see if that happens. Now, the black king comes to h8. So the idea behind h8 is that now the king is no longer, the pawn is no longer pinned behind the king. So we are now threatening to take the knight, which is always good news. So we've got to react to that. So as planned, the knight comes to f6. The rook takes the pawn because, well, this pawn is attacked twice and only defended once. So Capablanca takes a free pawn, which is always good. The there's a load of pressure on your knight now, and you'd like to keep your knight there if you can, so you relieve a bit of the pressure by capturing the rook. Queen recaptures, only move, and now bishop b1, just bringing another piece into the attack. Capablanca wants to get these minor pieces into the game, so he plays knight c6 and bishop f5. So this is a... I think Sarah was asking why not rook takes on d6, but I think I might have explained. She was saying why don't rook takes d6 here? That's because the queen captures the rook there. Sorry, where were we? So bishop e1, knight c6, and this is a weird move. Bishop f5. You might be thinking, hang on a minute, what's going on here? So why is White just moved his bishop to a place where it can be taken by a pawn? Doesn't this just blunder a bishop? So if you do take the bishop, unfortunately you essentially run into a checkmate in 2 moves, because the queen comes to h6 and you're threatening checkmate on this square because it's defended by the knight and you take it with your queen. The only move to prevent checkmate is to give up your queen, and well, you've just given up your queen. So easily winning for Frank James Marshall. So you can't take the bishop, and the nice thing is that once you realise you can't take the bishop, well, it also comes with an attack on the rook. So it's sort of like a free move because black has to react. So the rook's got to move. So rook comes to d8, just going on the same line as the queen. Always a good idea. And this is a really interesting position in the game because there is a really, really strong move which Marshall could have played in this position, which would have allowed him to keep pushing the attack and maybe to beat Capablanca in the game. The move that was played was h4, which is a little bit too slow. And it's really, this move is really like a disgusting move. It's like, it sort of makes sense when you see it, but it's one of those moves where you really have to just think about every single thing that black could do in response, because it's something you might just completely write off if you saw it. So the idea is to play bishop d7. Now, why is that a good move? 2 pieces can take it. It's only defended by the knight. The idea is that it puts black in, and we mentioned this word last week, like a Zugzwang. So the idea is that black doesn't have any good moves. So why is it a Zugzwang? So if you take with the queen, well, number one, you might just say, well, that just gives up your queen. But even worse, actually, it just loses to checkmate in 2 moves. Queen comes here, and there's no defense against queen captures checkmate on this square. Okay, you can put your queen here to block it for 1 move, but you just take with your queen and then you're done. Or rather, you take with the pawn, and then you're still threatening checkmate on the square. So you cannot take with the queen. What about taking with the rook? Well, taking with the rook runs into the same idea, because the queen comes here, and you might be thinking, now, this time, can't the queen just take the knight? Well, if the queen takes the knight, the white queen just comes here and delivers checkmate yet again. You can't move the knight because that just hangs the bishop, so the bishop gets taken. So the queen can't capture, the rook can't capture, the knight can't even move. And the only other move is to just sort of move your rook or your king and just sort of delay. And in which case, white will have time to push these pawns up the board to get his rook into the game, and he's going to have a nice game. So a really impressive move, and it would have been amazing if Frank James Marshall had found it. But he still plays a decent principled move to try and break open the position. But yeah, nowhere near as good as bishop d7. So how does the game continue? So knight e7, just getting the knight into the game as planned, comes with an attack on the bishop, and now you sort of are threatening to take the bishop. So first, knight e4 with an attack on the queen, so you need to react to that before you take the bishop. The queen moves, and now queen f6 check. So again, another forcing move, you have to react. King comes to g8, and now trying to further complicate the position, bishop e6. Again, you might be thinking, well, hasn't he just blundered his bishop? He's just put it there, the pawn can take it. Well, the answer is sort of yes. He's really trying to make something happen. Like, you're already 2 pawns down against Capablanca. this attack almost has to work, otherwise it's just the end of the game. So obviously you're threatening to take this if black just makes a slow move. So black basically has to take the bishop, and Capablanca calculates precisely as he enjoys doing, and he does. He takes the bishop. Okay, you get this queen takes e6 with check, which is nice. You win back the pawn with check, but you did just give up a bishop. So the king comes to f8, and now knight g5, so threatening checkmate on this square. So how do you defend that? So a very nice move by Capablanca. You take the knight back to g8. We don't normally like to put knights on the edge of the board, but if it stops you from losing, and if it works, then it works. So the reason that works is now the queen defends this whole line, so this is no longer threatening checkmate. And also it's very nice because the black knight defends this square, and this is quite a horrible square to allow your opponent's pieces to go onto, especially queens and rooks and things. So how's the attack going to continue? f4. So just trying to break open these lines. If black does nothing, you can capture the pawn and bring your rook into the game with check. Capablanca played rook e8 in this position, which is technically a blunder. The idea, you might think, well, this is a very principled move. Like it puts the rook into a more defensive position. It attacks the queen, so your opponent has to react to it. What's wrong with that? So the problem is that after you can just ignore the threat, essentially. You can say, well, after f takes, if you want to take my queen, then I will take back with my knight, and after your king moves, I will win your queen. And now if you look at the material on the board, Frank James Marshall is actually the one who's up in material. So the idea is this rook e8 move doesn't actually really accomplish a lot, because white's plan, which was to capture the pawn, f takes e5, can still go ahead. And in fact it does. That was what was played. So f takes e5, and instead of rook captures, rook e7, just adding more protection to this rank. Rook f1 check, again as planned, just getting a rook into the game with check, a nice move. King g7, and again just continuing with the merciless assault. All your pieces are aimed at the black king. You need something to happen. h5, just trying to break open this position. Bishop e8, just bringing back another defender. It would be nice now if white would capture, because then you can just bring a bishop into the game defended by the pawn. But instead we get h6 check. And you can play king captures here, but that looks a bit horrible, and it might be one of those positions where it's very hard to defend if you're not a computer. And also Marshall might have been hoping for knight captures, because if knight captures, you get a nice forced checkmate in 2, where the queen comes to f6, defended by the pawn, and the king only move is to go back here, and then king f8, checkmate, defended by the rook. So instead, Capablanca opts for king h8, hiding in the corner of the board, and now queen d6. So again, another really nice move by Marshall. Like, he's really testing his opponent with all these moves, because if Capablanca doesn't play the correct responses, I'm always going on about how, like, when you're the attacking player, your opponent has to make the really precise moves, otherwise they're just going to be lost. But if you do manage to make those precise moves, you can come out of the in a winning position, and this is what's going to happen with Capablanca. He already has made such moves, and he will continue to make such moves. So why is Marshall offering a queen trade here when he's down 2 pawns? Well, the idea is if you take the queen, obviously you recapture with the pawn, the rook has to move, and now unfortunately you lose the bishop, because the rook comes here to attack the bishop, and there's no defense against this, because like the bishop's blocked in by the rook, and if the bishop comes here, it's captured by the knight. If the rook comes back to defend the bishop, then you can simply push d7, and if the bishop I'll just show you that. The rook comes back, you push d7. If the rook captures, you take the bishop, and if the bishop captures, you take the rook. So not something you want to do. So yeah, you're just going to blunder a bishop if you do that. So instead of capturing with the queen c5. So Capablanca offers a queen trade on his own terms. He says, well, if you want to trade queens, you're going to take my queen here, and I'm going to take back here. But Marshall says no. I'm going to offer you a queen trade on my own terms. He says I'm going to go to d4. And now if you take my queen here, I'm going to take back here and have a nice little pawn chain in the middle of the board. So again, Capablanca declines and plays rook takes on e5, winning a pawn. Queen goes to d7, and this threatens checkmate on 2 squares. Threatens checkmate here, defended by the pawn, and you're also threatening to take this pawn because it's defended by the knight. So what do you do here? How do you prevent this? If you... Oh, sorry about that. You might be thinking, doesn't this just blunder the queen? Because you've moved your queen to a square where it can just be taken. Well, if it is taken, then the knight comes here with checkmate, because the pawn defends that square, and obviously the knight attacks the king. So that's a lovely little move. So you can't take the queen. So instead, rook comes to e7, and now we get rook f7, and again, Marshall gives his opponent another opportunity to mess it up, because he was probably hoping for something like rook takes queen, because if rook takes queen and the rook recaptures, we've already seen the bishop takes the rook and we get a lovely little checkmate again. Unfortunately, Capablanca coolly just says, well, I'm going to take your queen with my bishop rather, and in this position FJM, Frank James Marshall, resigned the game. So yeah, it's a bit of a roller coaster game. Like, Marshall just attacked for the whole game, and actually Capablanca was able to pull it back. And there was this sort of pivotal moment after rook d8 where Marshall could have played the amazing bishop to d7, but yeah, he didn't choose to do that. Now, I think as usual, that only took about half an hour, so if people want to send me any challenges on Live Chess in the next 15 minutes, I'm happy to play a few games. So I'll wait a minute for any to roll in. If no one wants to play, I will end the stream, and if people wish to play, then we'll have a few challenges, and I think I'll sign off there. So